Thank you very much for everybody joining the session this afternoon. Really good to see quite a number of people joining, so that is great. I'll talk to you a little bit more about the structure of the webinar this afternoon and the purpose and kind of what we're doing in a moment. But just a quick way of introduction, I'm Michael Appleby, the Managing Director from Altair Consulting. So I look after Altair's broad range of consultancy services, including our transformation, technology, governance, regulation, and other work as well. And it involves quite a lot of work with clients at the moment on some of the consumer regulation work. So it's good to see a number of people on the call, and thank you for joining. Hoping to have quite an insightful, energetic, and hopefully thought-provoking session this afternoon as well, which should be really good. In terms of the session, in terms of the purpose, really, this is the second webinar of a series of webinars that we are running, with background context being, of course, that we're all aware that 1st of April isn't too far off now. It's only, 30-40 days away now. It's come around quick when the new consumer regulatory environment comes into force. And we were keen to put this webinar series together to give the chance, really, to do a bit of a deeper dive into what the new regulatory standards mean, what they mean in practice. Give a chance to hear some real insights from experts involved in working with clients across the housing and local authority sector at the moment. Help build a bit of an understanding of the broader kind of regulatory environment and where it's going to come from and where it's heading as well, and work through build a bit of an understanding of the options for delivery, some of the best practice that we're seeing in the sector as well. But we're really keen with these webinars to give a chance to kind of really focus on the practical implications of the new standards rather than keep it at a more of a conceptual level. So today we're very much focused, as you can see there, on the Tenancy Standard. We've previously run a webinar, it's about 3 or 4 weeks ago now, on the Neighbourhood and Community Standard, and we've got other webinars coming up in 2 in March, 1 in March, 1 in April, 1 in May, where we look at each of the other areas as well. So we're given a real good chance to do a bit of a deep dive into each specific area. And it goes without saying that this is a topic which is top of the priority list of a number of boards and execs, and also staff delivering a lot of the work as well at the moment. So really hoping that the webinars can really help in your planning and build your understanding of the topic as a whole. So with all of that in mind, I'm really pleased to welcome 3 guest speakers to the webinar this afternoon. So Anne-Marie Bancroft, Bekah Ryder, and also Samantha Grix as well. So just a way of introduction, so Anne-Marie is Altair's consumer regulation lead. She is leading on a lot of work with clients at the moment on preparing for the post-April environment, but also helping clients deal with some of the challenges that exist today already with engagement from the Housing Ombudsman, working through things like customer engagement activities and other areas as well. And she's got significant experience of working in the housing sector for a number of years. Bekah Ryder is Altair's Research and Insights Manager. Again, done a huge amount of research activity in the housing sector. Bekah previously was at the NHF before joining Altair, and since joining Altair has been involved in a number of different research projects which are relevant to the topic today, particularly on right sizing and tenure and other areas as well. And also a massive welcome to Samantha Grix from Devonshires as well. So Samantha is a partner at Devonshires, works with local authorities and housing associations, and covers off a broad range of advice on regulatory matters, particularly on rent, but also on tenancies and leases as well. So we'll bring a huge amount of experience of the real kind of practical implications of the regulatory environment to the session today. So big welcome to all 3, and thanks in advance for their effort and work that's already been put into the presentations. In terms of the agenda, we'll just jump onto the next slide. So we've got around about 90 minutes put to one side for the webinar this afternoon. We've got the 3 presentations from Anne-Marie, Bekah, and Samantha to come in a moment. I think that the presentations will be around about 10 to 15 minutes each. So we should have plenty of time at the end of the session for questions as well. In terms of the structure of the topics, Anne-Marie is going to be covering off a bit of a broader review of the regulatory environment and the changes that are coming through. Bekah is going to talk through a bit more specifically about allocations and social renters and right sizing, particularly in relation to the Tenancy Standard, and then Samantha will cover off a bit more on the kind of the risk and some of the challenges in terms of taking this standard forward as well. we're really keen for these webinars to be engaging and give you as kind of attendees lots of opportunity to ask questions and get the content that you need from the webinars as well. So I really do encourage participation, and I think we can ask questions by just adding them to the chat, which there's a little button, I believe, in the bottom of the screen. So please do add those as we work our way through a presentation. We'll probably save the questions for the Q&A discussion at the end, but please do add them as we work our way through. We can ask those at the end. Also, just worth noting, we're obviously recording this webinar, so it will be available for others who aren't able to attend today. But also, if you need to drop off, you can get back onto it at a later time to see the rest of the recording. And also, as I mentioned a couple of times, as part of a series of webinars, we'll have a QR code that you can scan at the end of the presentation to be able to sign up to the other webinars as well. So I think that's probably my introduction done. So I'll pass you over to Anne-Marie, who's going to kick us off with the first presentation.
Okay, thank you, Michael. So those who've attended this series of webinars before, you might have heard some of the tone rhetoric that I'm going to pass through again to put the context behind everything that we're going to discuss today. So I want to go back to core purpose on the regulatory changes. So the reason we're in this position and the reason that there's a need for such huge change is that after Grenfell, government identified that there's a systemic failure in the building management of high-rise buildings, but also broader concerns about how social housing tenants were treated across the country. Now, government's put in place 3 key mechanisms when we look at tenants and residents to be able to address those concerns. One being the introduction of a new building safety regulator that sits within the Health and Safety Executive. But their touch point to residents is making sure that there's mandatory engagement plans on high-rise blocks, and that residents have a say about the changes that affect their building. Equally, they set up they've strengthened the Housing Ombudsman Service, and we've seen that's probably the thing that we can see a lot in the sector at the moment, where we've got a complaints handling code due to be a statutory code in April, complaint handling failure orders, and then systemic and thematic investigations. And then finally, we've got proactive consumer regulation. The regulator of social housing has always regulated against the economic standards proactively. However, their ability to regulate for consumer was only ever responsively at a really high threshold through the serious detriment test. Now, serious detriment test is now gone, meaning that the regulator of social housing can now proactively assess whether organisations are delivering against consumer standards. There's 2 sets of consumer standards when we talk about them, and I'll discuss them in detail on the next slide a bit more. So what the regulator of social housing now has is proactive inspections. When we look at local authorities, because they've never had to, apart from the rent standard, don't have to have much concern about the economic standards or much power in that area about the economic standards. It's a new proactive regulatory environment that local authorities haven't experienced for some time. So when we look at proactive consumer regulation, I think it's really important that we understand that it's one of the mechanisms that's been put in place to try and overhaul some of those systemic failings. And nonetheless, regulatory environments will never change cultures in the way that they may intend. It's ultimately down to organisations to make sure that they achieve things for their customers. The regulator of social housing regulation is a co-regulatory approach. So ultimately, the consumer regulator or the regulator of social housing will expect you to comply with regulation. However, it's not going to prescribe how you do it. So that's a good background as to why we're here. It's ultimately, when we look at culture and when we look at some of the real learnings that we've seen post-Grenfell, is we know that the regulatory environment alone won't change things for residents. It ultimately comes down to organisations. There has been a huge timeline, and we've seen initially a green paper, then a white paper, and then a bill, and now an act. Act. So originally we saw the tenant satisfaction measures that came out quite early. So they're now being gathered and collected and reported, or due to be reported in June to the regulator for large providers. The Act was only granted royal assent on the 20th of July last year, so we've not had a huge amount of lead time. And then the new consumer standards were published in October. Now they have been consulted on. The consultation is closed, and it's anticipated that final versions will be out over the next few weeks. So we'll be expecting them to be out. Nonetheless, the word from the regulator has always been, look at the existing consumer standards, because there's always been a set of consumer standards that organisations have had to comply with, and look at the new consumer standards and get on with things. It's never been a case of sit back, wait until we've published and then work out what you're doing. It's always been a case of getting on with things. And come the 1st of April, that's when we'll actually see the change in the regulatory environment. So that will mean that if an inspection is conducted by the regulator of social housing after the 1st of April, they will be assessing how organisations comply with all of the consumer standards, which means that there are people within organisations who've worked in operational teams that may have never experienced proactive regulation in the same way. So it's a real step change for people within organisations. Some organisations may look back to how it worked in a proactive consumer environment in the past. But nonetheless, we're in a more mature world now, where we can understand data, insight, information to really understand how an organisation is running and how the experiences and what experiences of customers are having. So that's the change that we're going to see. So 1st of April, change to inspections, and a real change in expecting compliance in these areas. Prior, we were talking compliance was only ever focused on serious detriment. So the revised consumer standards, there were 4 standards historically, and there will be 5 standards. The home standard has been renamed to the safety and quality standard. Obviously, all the new standards are in draft form. And the tone of the change from home to safety and quality shows how the regulator is changing its stance, a bigger focus on safety and quality. Tenant involvement and empowerment, the tone again has really changed to transparency, influence and accountability, more output focused rather than activity focused. Involvement and empowerment used to be quite subjective, but transparency, influence and accountability can be evidenced. So a real step change in that standard. Neighbourhood and communities remain the same, as is the tenancy standard, but we have got a new tenant satisfaction measures standard, which forms part of the suite of consumer standards as well. When we look at the tenancy standard, it looks at some key areas of focus: allocations and lettings, how homes are being allocated, tenancy sustainment and evictions, tenure and mutual exchange. And the key changes to the tenancy standard here is that the allocations and lettings are focused on letting in a fair and transparent way that supports the local authority's housing function and homelessness function. There is a requirement to offer the right tenure and to make sure that it's done so in light of the right type of accommodation. There is less pressure in relation to voids. Also, there is an additional expectation in relation to tenancy fraud, and we look at more expectations on cases of tenancy sustainment and evictions, so providing more advice and support for cases of evictions and end of licence, of which wasn't expected previously. There is an enhanced expectation on mutual exchange to provide support to those who are allowed to mutually exchange their homes. Quite specific and complex advice. Anyone who's actually handled mutual exchange, the switch of the 2 tenancies that may have different tenure terms isn't as simple as you might feel. So hugely complex changes to the tenancy standard there. I'm going to pass over to Bekah, who's who's going to give an overview of allocations and downsizing and right sizing in her presentation. So I'll stop sharing my slides, Bekah.
Thanks, Anne-Marie. So shout if you can't see that. It should be appearing for everybody. I'm just going to talk a bit about allocations and social renters. So just to give a bit of context, as we're all aware, there's a crisis in housing supply. So this is a chart looking at the total dwelling stock in England over time and the different tenure of that stock. And you can see that while owner occupation has grown, that's the dark green, and also the rented privately has grown a lot more recently. The amount of social housing, that's blue rented from private registered providers and orange rented from local authorities, has actually shrank. So it's gone from 31% of England's housing stock in the late 70s, early 80s to 16% in 2022. So that is a difference of around 5.5 million to 4.1 million. And that means that social housing is a scarce resource, and allocations has to determine who qualifies for that. In terms of the policies, there's no single system even within a local authority area. You might have the local authority allocation scheme as well as a housing association's allocation scheme, and any local letting schemes for different new build or particular estates. 91% of local authorities operate a choice-based letting scheme, which came in, I think it was the early 2000s, wasn't it, under New Labour. And I thought this quote is quite interesting in terms of Amnesty International, just from a kind of perspective of somebody that's applying for housing or is experiencing homelessness. And Amnesty International concluded that England's housing and homelessness system is effectively a grueling obstacle course with housing as a prize for those who make it to the end. And there's also lots of differences between the policies between local authorities and housing associations, which might be around bedroom standards and income limits. So there's a lot of complexities there. When we look at how many on the housing waiting list, we can see that it's sitting at 1.28 million households in 2023. And of those, 46% are actually in a reasonable preference category. And that was sort of going down a bit until the Homelessness Act in 2002, and then changes brought about by the Localism Act, which gave more discretion to local authorities around their allocations policy, also led to some changes in a bringing down of the demand. But that's whether that housing waiting list is actually the true figure of how many people are in housing need. So the NHF did research that found that the true figure is much higher. So you've got people, hidden households, so to speak, that are living in overcrowded accommodation or inappropriately housed in private rented sector. And that actually estimates that the true figure of people waiting is 1.6 million. In terms of lettings, we can see that around 50% of lettings in 2022-23 were to people in a reasonable preference category, and there's been a real uptick in the number of people that were statutorily homeless prior to letting, which is driven by the large increase that we've seen in the number of people that are owed a main housing duty. And in terms of what it means for who lives in social housing, when we look at the difference between tenures, we can see, so the social renters are the third bar along here. I've tried to split it up in terms of colours. Like I said, the purples are people that are couples, and there's people sharing as like orange and yellow, and then the lone household, so like one female, one male, or a lone parent, they're in the kind of greens and blues. And you can see that social renters have more people that are single person or lone parent households. So that's 67% in social housing, but in all households in England, it's 43%. When it comes to disability, you're much more likely to have a long-term illness or disability if you're living in social housing. So that's nearly 57% of people heading up households in social housing who have a long-term illness or disability. Yet only 21% of local authorities in England have an accessible housing register. And when we look at lettings again, we can see that 6% of general needs lettings were to properties that were built or adapted to wheelchair users standards. And that has increased since 2007, but it's still only 6%. And 17% of the households that were being let to had disability or access related issues. So it looks like there's a problem in terms of supply there potentially. In terms of age profile, I think this is quite interesting that the grey there is social renters, and that shows that you've got kind of an even distribution across the age groups by tenure, and it more reflects the population. Whereas when you look at private renters, it's much more likely to be younger people. So private renters is the dark blue there, and you can see that there's more people in the 16 to 24 category living in private rented accommodation. And for owner occupiers, it increases with age. So the most owner occupiers are actually in the older age categories compared to other tenures. When it comes to ethnicity, actually, social renters aren't as ethnically diverse as private renters. But interestingly, when you split up the social renters into housing association and local authority, you can see that you have more non-white ethnic groups living in local authority housing. And that's a reflection of where that stock is located, largely in cities with bigger populations from those ethnic groups, such as Birmingham and London. In terms of economic status, probably not a surprise that in the bottom right there, in the kind of burgundy colour, that's the social renters. 41.6% of social renters are working, but actually compared to other tenures, there's more inactive. So there's nearly 24% are economically inactive there. And when you compare that to private renters, there's many more of them working, and the same with buying with a mortgage. Outright owners, there's a more retired, which again reflects the age groups of people living in that accommodation. If you're living in social housing, you're more likely to be from the lower income quintile, which is your earnings, your weekly income is between £76 and £360, whereas it's much more evenly spread in private renters. Buying with a mortgage, you're more likely to be earning more in that fifth income, in the highest income group. And you're also more likely to be in relative poverty. So this is the light green here. So if you're below, you're in the low income threshold, so you're in relative poverty, then you're more likely in social housing. That's the most likely tenure of people in the low income bracket. When you look at it for all households, it's only around 30%, but for social housing, it's just over 50%. And you're also more likely to be in receipt of state support. So that can be income related, like universal credit, as well as non-income related, like carers allowance. And you also would have people own outright because, again, the age groups, you're more likely to be getting pension credit or similar type of benefits. And just touching briefly on right sizing, we've done research with local authorities to develop their policies here, involving surveys of stakeholders and of tenants, and also interviews with tenants. And there's a lot of complexities around drivers and barriers to right sizing. And largely it fits in with that kind of personal, what's right for the tenant, their emotional ties to their house, and what house is right for them. There's also the kind of financial drivers and barriers, so they might be subject to the bedroom tax, and practical around if they've lived in a house for a really long time, how do they declutter and move out? But they might actually want to move out because they can't look after a home of that size anymore. They might want, in terms of social, they might want to move closer to friends and family, but they don't want to move away from their existing support network. And there's lots of other considerations, which again link up to their kind of personal barriers and personal situation, which might include having decorated their house and not wanting to leave a home that's they've made their own. And how registered providers are currently addressing that. Largely it's around, so when we reviewed the different policies in place, it's largely financial incentives, and there's a huge range in terms of the amount of incentive given. And most of it is based on the bedroom size being given up, but also it could be around whether they're giving up an adapted property. So the incentives range from £1,000 to up to 30,000, depending on the type of property and where the property was located. There was also discretion to increase financial support if that was what would unlock a move from right sizing, and using some of those incentives to cover the cost of repairs or clear arrears, or give them help to move, such as hiring a van. There's also practical support that helps with that personal emotional side of things, such as right sizing officers or arranging removals. And then it's important for some people, the reason we call it right sizing rather than downsizing is because that people might actually be allowed to keep a spare bedroom. So it's about people finding a home that's best suited to their needs, and that might not necessarily be moving to a 1-bed house from a 4-bed house, but just to something a bit smaller that then frees up a larger property for other people in need. The other support that people offered were around helping people plan for their new home and helping them fill in the paperwork. We're offering things like mutual exchange events so that people could meet other tenants and help them find somebody that they could swap with. And finally, just when we look at the policy and practice side of things, we can see from local authority housing statistics that 97% of local authorities give priority to under-occupiers in allocations policies. 77% of those who disqualified people due to rent arrears give an exception when it comes to downsizing. But still, less than 1% of lettings each year are actually to people who left their last home due to under-occupancy. And the majority of these weren't actually moving because they were offered an incentive. So they were much more likely within that group to have had no incentive to move, but then still been able to make that. And that's just a bit of an overview. And I'm going to hand over to Sam now to talk through the legal foreseeable challenges.
I can find my unmute button then. So I'm going to talk about some foreseeable challenges with the Tenancy Standard. Now, I think it's clear that there's not been a massive overhaul of this standard. So there's quite a bit that's still in there from before. But there are some key things that we see occur with challenges, and we think they're going to follow through. Could you possibly go to the next slide, please, Bekah? Thank you. So policies, it's a massive point generally when you're managing housing stock. You need to make sure your policies address what you need them to address, and it's going to be important with all of the changes to the consumer standards that you check your policies and make sure they align, because that's one point, one thing that is so obvious could happen down the line is where they've not been updated and there's some changes which I'm going to touch on, and Anne-Marie's touched on. When if you don't pick them up, that you're going to be right for challenge in that case. So it's really important. I've listed some of the policies where the Tenancy Standard may well feed in, but you may have others as well that you have within your organisation that are relevant for the Tenancy Standard as well. So one of the things we also see now and then is where people are letting properties on the incorrect tenure for the type of property that you're letting. So we know that general needs housing should be on a fully assured or 5-year fixed term tenancy after the starter period. But sometimes people get mixed up about what classification of rent they have, and some classifications of social housing require a specific tenancy. For example, intermediate rent dictates an AST. If you're granting a fully assured tenancy, that's not technically in compliance. So we need to make sure that we're checking what tenure we're offering for the type of property and ensure that we are adhering to the Tenancy Standard. Now, there's a massive warning sign here because we've got renters reform in the pipeline, and ASTs could be out the window, in which case we're looking at 2 forms of tenure, which is fully assured or licenses. It's not clear at the moment when that's going to be coming in, and I've heard whispers that it may not come in. I'd be surprised, but we just don't know what's going to happen. So albeit we have the draft revised Tenancy Standard, that is going to have to be amended if renters reform comes in. So we're going to have to revisit tenure and what we are expected to offer our social housing tenants. But with this slide really is just to flag that you need to know what your stock is to make sure that you're granting the correct tenure for that type of stock. General needs supported, but equally the rent classifications and whether there's any specifics about what type of tenancy or license or whatever it is you need to grant for those properties. So knowing your stock is a really important point that runs through this. And, Michael mentioned that I do rent regulation, and obviously knowing your stock and knowing the rent classification in that context is ever so important. And they do link in on some occasions. Thanks, Bekah. So the next couple of points I wanted to mention was about sustainment and eviction, because the draft Tenancy Standard addresses both of those things. So really what we need to think about with this is we're going to be updating some of our materials that we're sending out, our policies, but also our letters. equally, how are you going to be documenting the fact that you are doing what the standard says? Because it's going to be very hard for the regulator to say, well, how are you offering to help residents sustain their tenancy? So it's going to be really important that your documents back you up. So consider what services and signposting we're offering to residents to maintain their tenancy, because that is in the revised tenancy standard. And again, how are we going to evidence this? Put it in your letters, put it in your policy. You're going to be splashing this about to show that you're complying with the requirements under the standard. And how do you bring these services to residents' attention? They may well be in letters, which is great because that's your documentary evidence that you're complying. But are we doing anything else to bring it to their attention? Are we bringing it to residents groups? Are we, we should be consulting with residents and engaging with our residents about housing management and things like this. Is this a way you can try and get residents involved to shape the way in which you can, the services that they think would be helpful, signposting that they think would be helpful? So I think it would be worth sort of engaging with your residents in respect of this and what they want, really, because we're trying to work out how we can better sustain tenancies, and they may well be your best side about what you can offer and how you do it. In terms of evictions, we are going to be required to provide pre-eviction advice about their housing options. So the Code of Conduct says that we have to do this in a timely fashion. So we are going to have to do this well before the point the bailiffs are at the door. So we need to provide them with information about what their housing options are. Where do they need to go to try and seek help for their housing options? And again, this is all going to be documented in your letters, but it's really important that we are offering this assistance. And it might be that you put it into, more than one letter, because you'll be writing to your residents. If you're at the point of evicting someone for arrears or whatever, you're going to be writing to them to warn them, etc. And if it's at the point of eviction, we need to be, flying the flag and showing that we are complying with the tenancy standard, and that documentary evidence is going to be really important. Thanks, Bekah. So the final point I wanted to mention was about tenancy fraud, because we have enhanced requirements in respect of tenancy fraud. It's really important when you're looking at the consumer standards that we look at the Code of Conduct as well, because that's got further guidance in for you. And the Code of Conduct says that RPs should be carrying out effective checks before the start and during the tenancy. Now, we know that people undertake, tenancy audits and things like this, but is this requiring us to do far more of a rigid regime and a more regular regime of undertaking tenancy audits and finding out what's going on in our properties? TBC, I'm putting it out there to question, and we need to think about how, again, we're going to evidence the fact that we're carrying out effective checks before and during the tenancy. We need to be publicising our approach, including the outcomes to tackling tenancy fraud. So that presumably would be in if you have a tenancy fraud policy, or you may well have, something on it on your website, but making sure you are publicising what approach you are taking when it comes to tenancy fraud, so that if anyone's looking for it, they can find that information. Because publicising, that is something the regulator can check. They will be able to see if you're publicising. Is it on your website, or is it in tenant communications? How are you publicising it? So worth having a think about that. And finally, providing guidance to staff on how to prevent, detect and take action against suspected tenancy fraud. Most, organisations do generally have, staff are upskilled. They know to look out for fraud, and sometimes it just smacks them around the face. But actually, do we need to have a think about how staff approach this and what steps they can take to sort of root things out if they have any suspicions, or even where they don't, and what sort of questions they should be asking, obviously in a accusatory way, but we need to make sure that staff know what they're looking for, and what they need to do to prevent it getting to the point of tenancy fraud, and again, what to do when they find out that there is potential fraud taking place, so legal proceedings.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Samantha, and thank you to all three speakers for really interesting, insightful presentations. Thank you for that. To everybody who's joined in the virtual audience, if you've got any questions now for either Anne-Marie, Bekah, or Sam, please do add them to the Q&A, and we will try and work through any questions that do come in. But a couple from me just to kind of get things off. One of the big themes that came through there was around, particularly in kind of Sam, your presentation, but also reference to it in Anne-Marie's and Bekah's, was around the need to kind of review policies and make sure they're up to date with the new environment. And Sam, you mentioned 4 or 5 kind of policies, but I just wondered if there was any kind of key priority areas or any key kind of potential pitfalls that are kind of out there that we're sort of seeing clients kind of pop up for clients already, and actually, what's your advice on what would be the top 2 or 3 areas really to kind of focus on in terms of policy area? And I might just ask a bit of a follow-on question after that about kind of engaging with customers and residents. So any particular thoughts on kind of priorities of key policies that you should really focus on to get things started?
Well, your allocation policy is going to be really important. Make sure that is correct. But again, the tenure point, I think, is really important, but we don't really know what's going to come once renters reform comes in. So I think it's going to be making sure you hit all the markers in all of your policies. There isn't going to be one that's more important than the other, really, because you could be caught with any of them. But keeping an eye on the landscape and seeing where we are with renters reform on the tenure, because that is where the regulator is very interested, is to make sure people are in the correct tenure and you're not trying to put them on a lesser tenure than they're entitled to by regulation, because that could be detriment. A lot of this, even if they don't hit the markers, there probably won't be detriment to a particular person, albeit it's regulation and you must comply. With the tenancy side of things, in terms of tenure, that is something that's important.
That's helpful. So looking at the kind of the broad suite is the key things. It's the kind of the devil's in the detail with this kind of thing a lot of the time. And Sam, you mentioned a couple of points around kind of engaging with customers, and maybe Anne-Marie, this is something for you and kind of your experience, but that kind of engagement with customers and tenants on kind of how to build out and develop policy that's fit for kind of the way that services are being delivered. Again, have you seen any kind of best practice and ways of engaging with customers to kind of review those policies and get them fit for purpose?
And there's a lot of different ways, and like as Sam mentioned, allocations policies are really important, and if there's anything within the sector that has a huge impact on people, it's the way homes are allocated and given to individuals. There was some recent good practice where there was legislative theatre in relation to allocations, but I think the importance of things is sort of understanding, first of all, your range of policy suite. If you look at your whole policy suite and say we need to engage with customers over every single one in the same way, then you won't be hitting what's important to residents. And having a look at what has the strongest impacts on residents and prioritising really good engagement in those areas rather than trying to focus on everything. So you might look at your allocations policy being a real priority for residents. However, another policy may not have as much importance to your residents. So using those as key ways of having discussions, translating policy language into everyday language is absolutely vital. The clients that we see who are capable of translating a huge allocations policy into a 3-page summary document for people who are applying for housing, so that they can understand how homes are allocated and where they sit in that prioritisation. And they're the best at speaking to and working with and being transparent to their residents. I think co-design in that area works really well. So being able to shape how that actually looks. If depending on what structure, because lots of organisations have very different engagement structures, there might be a requirement to engage with specific committees of your board. There might be requirements for scrutiny. You can use scrutiny as a tool to assess your allocation policy delivery. So there's lots of different ways that you can do it. You can do it in lots of creative, fun ways, but you can also do it in lots of strong governance and focused and ways with customers, but depending on which way, it's the most important thing is to listen to customers, but also be able to feedback what's deliverable, what's undeliverable. Having peers in the room to be able to understand what the situation is and convey that environment to customers is absolutely vital, and then feeding back. Sometimes things can't be deliverable. Allocations policies are particularly contentious because not everyone can apply to a housing register and immediately get the home that they want. So it's really important that providing really transparent, honest feedback to customers and building a really strong relationship through that engagement is probably the most important part of that activity.
Yeah, I was just going to add to that. It's also about partnership working because, as I mentioned, there's not always just one policy, allocations policy within a local area. So it's about working in partnership with other providers of social housing to make sure that if you think about it from the applicant's perspective, that there's as much comparability or across the different policies, and that it's readily understood what the differences are and why. And also, if there's any kind of checks that need to be done pre-tenancy, that you've got the information being passed on between the different partners, because what happens sometimes is somebody may be checked at the beginning when they join the housing waiting list, but they won't be rechecked again. So then they have to go through lots of checks from housing associations. So it's how you can remove some of those barriers and make it a bit easier from a tenant perspective.
That's really helpful. Anne-Marie, that kind of concept of legislative theatre sounded particularly interesting, but that point that comes through strongly there around kind of the cons and the transparency and the simplicity, I think is really important, because it goes back to one of the quote that Bekah, you had in your part of the presentation from Amnesty International about it being a gruel and obstacle course with housing at the prize. I mean, the complexity and the myth busting around it is really, really important, isn't it? There's a couple of questions kind of come through from the attendees. Sam, this is one for you. The question basically is, currently housing options advice for those threatened by eviction is being provided on a referral basis by a local authority's homelessness prevention service. In your opinion, is this likely to be compliant or found lacking? Does it need to be explicitly in-house?
I think it's fine to signpost. I think it's just making people aware of what the options are and where they should go for that help, because there will be a lot of services that you can't provide in-house, and you're not that person, you don't provide that function. So signposting is absolutely fine. I don't think that's a problem. Anne-Marie, Bekah, do you have any different views on that?
No. I think that was strong. That was strong agreement, wasn't it? There's another question come through. I think, Bekah, this one's probably for you, just around. Is there any? I think some of the stats and the information was a couple of years, 2018, 2019, 2021. Obviously, not for kind of quoting specifically now, but is that the up-to-date data that we've got, and is there more available, or do we generally just work on a bit of a time lag with some of this information?
Yeah, there's definitely a time lag. So the main source of data on relative poverty and receipt of state support, and also disability, is the Family Resources Survey. And the last data that was published for that is 2021-22. There are also, you might be aware of a lot of data quality issues in relation to the last iteration of that, partly due to the pandemic. So there's always a bit of a lag, and even in terms of stock data and rents and lettings, then the last data we have for that is from as at the 31st of March last year. So always a little bit of a lag, and some of it you can't get down to the level of detail that you maybe would want either. There's a lot of national data or regional data perhaps, but the local authority level or ward data.
Do we have any thoughts on what we might need to evidence where customers might be refused for help or advice? So kind of what needs to be in place to provide that evidence?
To evidence, I think evidencing it in process is the important thing for the regulator, because the regulator ultimately or rarely will busy itself with matters of individual tenants and look at individual tenant files at any point. However, if you were seeking possession of a property, the courts would judge that. So there is some evidence already required through pre-action protocol, which Sam will be better at describing than myself. So for the regulator, making sure that it's outlined in policy, process, and ways of working, that if you say you signpost, that you actually have a list of organisations you signpost to, so that there's actual evidence of where that actually is delivered. But in the main, from the regulator's perspective, they'll never look at individual case files. However, from a note-taking perspective, and as from operating in housing myself, it's a case of it being evidence that there's been an offer of support to a customer who may be facing eviction, and that they are able to take up that offer of support whenever they want. Normally we do tend to go towards written evidence, because that tends to be much more tangible and evidenced. So providing that within all of the commentary and conversations and letters that you're providing to residents is really important. Template letters can make sure that that's in place. I'll let Sam jump on that.
I think also if you have processes, procedures where you say, for your staff to follow when something occurs, if it's part of that procedure, that's also something that you can present should the need arise, to show that you are offering and that it's on your radar, and then staff are expected to follow that process.
I'm going to link to that as well. I reckon the evidence around what's in place. I mean, there's the broader kind of link between kind of tenancy sustainment and evictions and a harder approach, and the standard very much focuses on kind of tenancy sustainment and making sure that there's support in place. But of course, different providers, different landlords take slightly different approaches. Some are a bit more kind of contractual in the way that they manage tenancy. Some are a bit more supportive. Have any panel got any thoughts on kind of good practice that they've seen, or how to kind of best develop an approach on how that kind of balances those two drivers, which can be quite tough sometimes, and taking a harder versus a softer approach, and that overall kind of development of the offer?
There's a range of different organisations. So I think with the consumer standards, or with all regulation in social housing, there's a range of different types of providers with a range of different drivers behind what they want to achieve. So it does mean, when I mention like the co-regulatory approach, doing it in a way that suits your organisation but ultimately meets the outcomes that are expected from the regulator. So you might see at that really that softer end of housing, where there's organisations that are built up with their own in-house tenancy support functions, to the other end of housing, smaller providers that maybe only have a handful of units that don't have the financial capacity to deliver tenancy support. So it ultimately, there's no perfect good practice. It feels like the softer organisations are good practice, but it wouldn't be good practice at that smaller organisation end to be trying to deliver that kind of thing. So I think that finding the right approach for your organisation, thinking of your stock type, your culture, your governance arrangements, is the best way of actually providing one that lands well. So as much as I'd like to say it's really good if you could do this and have a really huge in-house tenancy support team, if that's at the detriment of you offering home quality to some customers, they've challenged that was good spend. So there's a question really for organisations. But yes, lots of lovely, really good, strong, supportive tenancy support organisations. We've seen a lot of organisations that are really good at tracking tenancies from the start to understand the risks associated with them. I think that they're really good if they've got if you've got that data skill in house. I think that's a really clever way of doing things.
I was just going to add to that as well. It is about understanding your customers ultimately. It is consumer regulations. It's understanding who your consumers are and tailoring your responses to that. So as Anne-Marie says, if you've got an understanding of where the tenancy failures happen, then what can you do to put in place support to stop that happening? If you have an understanding of how people like to be communicated with, and how are you responding to that, and how are you showing that you're meeting those expectations?
It's making sure it's accessible, isn't it? as well as us covering our bases with making sure it's documented, it's making sure it's accessible, and you're catering for the different needs of your client base.
Yeah. Thank you. So I think I've got two more questions. So if there's anybody else who's got any more burning questions that they'd like to add, please do add them to the Q&A now. One, Sam, just for you, which is from me also. The main thing is a lot of kind of what we look at in terms of the tenancy standard. There's a real kind of intersect between the tenancy standard and broader consumer regulation with other legal protocol. What's your advice on kind of getting it right, complying with the RSH elements and also meeting other legal requirements? I assume they all work together, or will there be areas of contradiction? I mean, is there something to be thinking about there?
Yeah, they should be. I mean, I don't think there's really a way out of either of them, Michael. Making sure we cross all those T's and dot all those I's, and it's making sure that all the interplay is understood by the teams that are implementing it. So yeah, I think it's understanding your sector and making sure you bring in those people. You know, if you aren't sure about one particular area, then, you know, reach out to you guys and you will be able to help them and guide them into what they need. So yeah, I think it's really important that you understand what your legal requirements are, because you're not going to get away with that. And it feeds into the regulation as well, because don't forget we have to comply with all relevant law.
Yeah, that's a good point. That part of the compliance is complying with all relevant law, which is
that
broad, isn't it?
That's us all.
Yeah, that catch-all. Last question, I think it's probably Anne-Marie and possibly Bekah as well, is just sort of thinking about post 1st April. This has come through from the attendees. As part of the approach to regulation, what range of colleagues do you think that the regulator might want to talk to in terms of kind of consumer matters as part of an idea, or kind of what comes next? Is it going to be broad and deep? Is it going to be very focused? Is it going to be a bit of a mix? Is it going to be tailored? But who do you think's going to be included?
Yeah, I think in the main, as a copy and paste from each organisation to organisation, you're seeing your executive and key members of your board, and then especially if you have customer committees to be spoken with as part of an inspection. If you're a local authority lead member for housing, will expect a conversation. In relation to if the regulator needs to sort of go into detail on particular points, there might be a need for them to speak to directors at the next level or key individuals within the organisation. But it would be uncommon, but it might be because of a particular area of interest of the regulator at the time. So that's generally what you'd expect. So in the main, staying up at that executive board / cabinet level, but on occasion going down a few more levels to some operational teams. Nonetheless, teams who are working operationally in the main now will be part of providing some of this evidence. The policy, procedure, compliance ultimately sits, well, not ultimately, but sits within their responsibilities and for reporting up to whoever the decision makers may be. So that's how I see things as it stands.
Massive thank you to Anne-Marie, Sam and Bekah for the presentation. It was really interesting. A lot to think about, and lots of good intel to kind of take away from it, and a good discussion in the Q&A. Thank you also for everybody for joining today. I've mentioned a couple of times this is part of a series of webinars. Up on screen now is a QR code which you can probably scan using your camera phone, smartphone, to be able to log in to the future webinars that we've got. So we've got Safety and Quality on the 7th of March, which is only a couple of weeks away. Transparency, Influence and Accountability on the 11th of April, and then tenant satisfaction measures on the 9th of May. So please do scan those if you're interested in signing up to those. But again, massive thank you to the three speakers. Thank you for everybody who's joined. Thank you for the questions as well, and enjoy the rest of your afternoon.